Welcome to the grim and unforgiving world of the Middle Ages, a time when justice knew little mercy and punishments were not just harsh, but terrifyingly inventive. Prepare to journey through the streets, squares, and dungeons of the era to discover how people were punished for theft, betrayal, heresy, and even idle gossip. This is not a story of heroes or battles, it's a history of fear, pain, and cruelty turned. In the Middle Ages, punishment was not only seen as a form of retribution but also as a visible deterrent to others. A society built on religious beliefs and feudal order viewed punishment as an essential tool for maintaining structure and obedience. Violating the law was considered a direct threat to that structure, and the response had to be firm, humiliating, and often painful. One of the most prevalent types of punishment was physical discipline. It required no specialized facilities, was easy to administer, and left a strong impression on both the offender and the surrounding witnesses. Among the most common forms were whipping and flogging. These were used against men, women, and even children. The accused would typically be tied to a wooden post or bench and their back exposed. Then came the lashes, executed with leather straps, rods, or knotted cords. The number of lashes varied depending on the offense, the offender's social status, and the judge's discretion. Floggings could be carried out inside town halls or publicly in marketplaces. Public executions or beatings were events, part punishment, part spectacle. Crowds gathered, including children, who were often brought along to learn about justice. The town's officials or lawmen would carry out the punishment with unwavering efficiency. After several lashes, the skin would split, bleeding through torn garments. The offender might faint or cry, but this rarely stopped the process. The point was not only to cause pain, but to make a lasting example. Cities and villages maintained official registers that outlined punishments for each offense. Petty theft, such as stealing bread or fruit, might not merit execution, but physical punishment was inevitable. Even if the person confessed and showed remorse, whipping would still follow. In rural communities, these punishments were sometimes more theatrical. Offenders could be locked in wooden cages and displayed at village entrances, enduring the jeers and stares of passers-by. Branding was another form of punishment, though used less frequently due to its permanence. A hot iron bearing a symbol or letter was pressed against the skin, usually the forehead, cheek, shoulder, or hand. The letter represented the crime, a T for thief, for example, or an A for adulterer. Branding was overseen by legal authorities or church officials. Crowds often gathered to witness the moment the iron seared the flesh. The scar left behind would follow the branded person for life, influencing future employment, marriage prospects, and social interactions. It marked someone as permanently untrustworthy. For repeat offenders, amputation was sometimes imposed. A second offense for stealing might mean the loss of a finger, a hand, or even an ear. The idea was not only to punish but to prevent future crimes by physically limiting the ability to commit them. These mutilations often led to poverty and homelessness, but such consequences were considered natural outcomes of moral failure. Accompanying many physical punishments were acts of enforced repentance. Offenders might be made to walk barefoot through the streets, dressed in sackcloth, with ropes around their necks and placards hanging from their shoulders describing their crimes. Bystanders could mock them, throw rotten food, or shout insults. The ritual was designed to humiliate and to reinforce the values of the community, showing that lawbreakers could never walk among others unnoticed. Public shaming extended to devices like the pillory and the stocks. These were wooden structures designed to hold the offender's head and hands or feet in place, often located in the center of town. The person could be left for hours or even days, exposed to the elements and the townspeople. Others might be forced to wear absurd costumes, such as donkey ears or feathers, emphasizing the foolishness of their deeds. Onlookers threw vegetables, dung, or whatever they could find. Children were encouraged to mock, while adults nodded in approval. These punishments reinforced group identity and morality. Through exclusion and ridicule, punishment in the Middle Ages was not a private affair. It was an event meant to be observed, discussed, and remembered. The suffering of the guilty reinforced obedience in the innocent. Compassion was rare and usually discouraged. If someone suffered, it was because they deserved it. The pain they endured was both a message and a tool of governance. Religious influence saturated these processes. Clergy members often blessed the executioners, led prayers before punishments, or offered last rites in cases of capital punishment. The events were framed as divine justice. Sometimes the offender was offered confession before the punishment, with the promise of forgiveness. What followed, pain, mutilation, or even death, was portrayed as cleansing. Suffering was redemption. The physical agony served the soul. Whipping, branding, amputation, and public shame made up the core of medieval justice. These punishments combined pain with spectacle, discipline with ritual. Over time, these practices evolved into more elaborate systems involving torture, execution, and imprisonment. But the core idea remained the same. Those who disobeyed the law were to be hurt, humiliated, or excluded. Justice, as understood in the Middle Ages, was not about rehabilitation. It was about control, obedience, and fear. As the Middle Ages progressed, justice extended beyond simple punishments to include complex and brutal systems of torture. Torture was not always intended as a penalty itself, but as a means of extracting confessions, uncovering additional accomplices, or compelling obedience to religious authority. It was especially favored in inquisitorial processes and in cases where public order or orthodoxy was believed to be at stake. The use of torture was institutional. Certain buildings were designated for the process, typically located near courts or monasteries. These rooms were dark, windowless, and equipped with devices constructed for physical torment. Every instrument had a purpose, refined over time for maximum pain with minimal bloodshed. Blood was seen as messy and unnecessary. True suffering could be achieved more efficiently through pressure, dislocation, stretching, and psychological terror. One of the most iconic devices was the rack. This consisted of a wooden frame, often reinforced with metal, with rotating rollers at each end. The accused would be tied by the wrists and ankles and slowly stretched by turning the rollers. Ligaments tore, joints separated, and the victim screamed. Torturers were trained to operate the rack in stages, tightening gradually, pausing for interrogation, then continuing. It was not unusual for someone to pass out from pain, only to be revived with cold water and subjected to further questioning. The strappado was another common method. A rope was tied to the victim's wrists behind their back. They were then hoisted into the air and suddenly dropped, their fall arrested just before hitting the ground. This sudden stop dislocated the shoulders, often permanently. The process could be repeated multiple times, with weights added to the ankles to increase the tearing of joints. The goal was not to kill, but to terrify and break the will. Torture also took psychological forms. Darkness, silence, cold, and isolation were used in conjunction with physical pain. Prisoners were blindfolded and held in underground cells, sometimes left alone for days or weeks. They would hear screams from neighboring chambers, the clatter of chains, or the sharpening of tools. These sounds were part of the experience, designed to increase anxiety and compliance. The pear of anguish was a metal instrument shaped like a hollow bulb with petals that expanded when turned. It was inserted into the mouth, rectum, or other orifices, and then opened slowly using a screw mechanism. Though rarely fatal, it caused intense pain and was often combined with other tortures to extract confessions or enforce silence. Religious courts, particularly during inquisitions, used torture to enforce orthodoxy. Heresy, real or suspected, was treated not only as a crime but as a threat to eternal salvation. Those accused of denying church teachings were forced to confess, even if the confession was false. Under duress, individuals admitted to impossible deeds, flying through the air, speaking with demons, or poisoning wells. Torture was considered acceptable in these cases because the goal was not personal revenge, but spiritual correction. Another device, the iron boot, encased the victim's foot and leg. Wedges were hammered into the space between the metal and the flesh, crushing bones with each strike. This method was particularly used to obtain rapid confessions. Torturers often threatened to continue with the other leg if answers were not satisfactory. Bones shattered, tendons snapped, and even if the victim survived, they might never walk again. The thumbscrew was a smaller, portable device. It crushed fingers or toes between metal plates. Sometimes it was used in early interrogation phases to test the victim's resolve before more serious measures were taken. It was simple, silent, and effective. Other small devices included spiked collars, heated tongs, and pincers used to tear skin or pull out nails. There were also the iron chair and the interrogation bench. The iron chair was covered in spikes and heated from underneath with coals. The victim was strapped in, sometimes for hours. The longer they sat, the more the spikes dug into their flesh, and the hotter the seat became. The bench, on the other hand, was used to bend the spine or pin the limbs in unnatural positions, often with rope-tightening mechanisms. Torturers operated under legal rules, often documented in court records. They were allowed to escalate procedures step by step with written authorization. However, these limits were frequently ignored. Interrogators justified harsher treatments by claiming the accused was withholding the truth or had committed multiple offenses. The line between judicial process and cruelty was blurred, especially since confession was treated as the highest form of evidence. Confessions made under torture were considered valid, but often required repetition. The victim had to confirm their confession later, in court, without coercion. This led to complex procedures where a tortured person would be brought before a judge, reminded of what they had confessed, and asked to repeat it. If they refused, torture could be resumed. This cycle ensured that most people said whatever was necessary to stop the pain. Torture was not reserved for men. Women, too, were subjected to these methods, particularly in cases involving accusations of witchcraft, adultery, or blasphemy. While modesty was sometimes cited as a concern, it rarely prevented the use of instruments like the breast ripper or the scold's bridle, devices designed to punish women specifically. The breast ripper used iron claws to tear flesh, while the bridle was a metal cage that fit over the head, often with a spike inserted into the mouth to pierce the tongue if the woman spoke. In many cases, victims of torture died not during the process but from infections, broken bones, or internal damage afterward. Medical attention was rare. If a person died before confessing, the body might still be displayed or buried without honors. If they survived, they were usually sentenced to further punishment, branding, exile, or execution. Despite its horrors, torture was considered normal. It was recorded in official documents, taught in legal manuals, and witnessed by officials and clergy. Crowds might not be allowed to observe it, but its results were shared publicly. People knew what awaited those who defied authority, and the fear alone kept many from challenging the system. Over time, some places began to question the usefulness of torture, but during the peak centuries of the Middle Ages, it remained central to justice. It was not merely about discovering truth. It was about reinforcing power, extracting obedience, and silencing dissent. Execution in the Middle Ages was the ultimate form of punishment. It was used not only to remove dangerous individuals from society, but also to serve as a public warning. Death was not simply an end. It was a carefully choreographed performance meant to reinforce the authority of kings, the church, and the law. The condemned person's final moments were turned into a spectacle of control. Hanging was among the most common execution methods. It was used for a wide range of crimes, including theft, treason, and desertion. The gallows were usually constructed in central locations, often on a hill or platform where many people could gather to watch. The process began with the escort of the condemned to the scaffold. The journey could take hours, with crowds following along, shouting, or praying. Once at the site, the person would be positioned on a trapdoor or ladder, a noose placed around the neck, and the sentence proclaimed aloud. The method varied depending on region and era. Sometimes the person was dropped suddenly, resulting in a quick neck break. Other times, they were left to strangle slowly, feet kicking above the ground, as the air was squeezed from their lungs. The longer method could take several minutes, and the crowd watched without intervention. Hanging was considered both effective and accessible. It required little equipment and could be repeated regularly. Beheading was another widely used method, particularly for members of the nobility. It was considered more honorable than hanging, though the actual procedure was not always clean. A skilled executioner was needed to complete the act in a single stroke. Blunt blades, trembling hands, or resistance from the condemned could result in multiple swings. Heads were sometimes displayed on spikes or gates afterward, especially in cases of rebellion or betrayal. Execution by sword was common in some regions, especially where it was part of a ceremonial process. The condemned knelt, hands tied or free, and lowered their head. The executioner raised a sword above them, often praying or chanting before striking. It was less theatrical than other methods, but it carried symbolic weight. Purity through steel, justice through finality. Burning at the stake was reserved for crimes considered especially grave, such as heresy, witchcraft, or blasphemy. The fire was both a punishment and a purification ritual. The condemned was tied to a wooden post, surrounded by kindling and logs, and often forced to wear a paper hat or sign stating their crime. Priests or judges read the charges, and the sentence was carried out before a watching crowd. Fire was not always fatal in its early stages. The heat caused skin to blister, clothing to ignite, and hair to burn away. Screams echoed through the air, and smoke clouded the area. Sometimes, if the crowd was merciful, stones were thrown to hasten unconsciousness. In other cases, executioners used wet wood to prolong the process, ensuring a slow, painful end. In some regions, the executioner would tie gunpowder to the condemned's body, allowing the fire to end more quickly with an explosion. This was viewed as a small mercy or a last favor granted by the authorities. Burning was also used as a warning to others, with ashes sometimes scattered in rivers or placed at crossroads to deter future crimes. Crushing was a rare but recorded form of execution. It involved laying the person under a large board and piling stones on top until the chest collapsed. The process was slow, methodical, and terrifying. It was used primarily in cases where the accused refused to enter a plea, forcing them to respond by the threat of suffocation and internal rupture. Drowning was another method, often applied in cases of witchcraft. Accused individuals were tied to weights and thrown into rivers or ponds. The principle was that innocence would be proven by floating, guilt by sinking. Either outcome typically led to death. Sometimes the individual was rescued if they survived the test, only to be executed formally afterward. In cities, executions were announced in advance. People gathered with food, children, and even instruments, turning the event into a form of community engagement. Vendors sold drinks, musicians played, and judges sat on raised platforms. The condemned was led through the streets, surrounded by guards as church bells tolled and sermons were preached. Public execution was part justice, part theater. Drawn and quartered was a punishment reserved for treason. It involved multiple stages. First, the person was tied to a horse or dragged behind a cart to the place of execution. Then they were hanged until near death, cut down, and subjected to disembowelment. The internal organs were often burned before their eyes, followed by beheading and the dividing of the body into 4 parts. These parts were sent to different regions and displayed on walls or bridges. The process was ritualistic, intended to show the complete destruction of the traitor. The remains were a constant visual reminder of the consequences of betrayal. Few dared challenge authority after witnessing such scenes. The executioner, though feared, was also respected. His role was essential to maintaining order, and he often held legal immunity. Some executions involved animals. In certain cities, trained dogs or pigs were used to maul the condemned as part of the sentence. This was especially true in cases of rape or violent assault, where it was believed that the punishment must match the brutality of the crime. While rare, these incidents were recorded and remembered for generations. Execution by boiling was used in some countries, particularly for poisoning. The condemned was placed in a cauldron of water, oil, or lead, which was then slowly heated. Screams echoed until unconsciousness took over, and death followed soon after. It was considered a fitting end for those who had murdered others in silence and secrecy. The use of execution was heavily influenced by class, gender, and religion. The wealthy might avoid the most brutal methods, while the poor suffered the full extent of the law. Women were sometimes spared public humiliation, though not always. Heretics and witches, regardless of background, were subjected to the harshest sentences. Despite the violence, executions were considered a necessary function of justice. They provided closure, demonstrated power, and reassured the population that order would be preserved. Each death served as a performance, a visible sign that authority would not tolerate defiance. The Middle Ages did not question the morality of execution. It was assumed to be righteous, especially when administered by divine or royal command. Death was viewed as the final lesson in obedience. It silenced dissent, erased guilt, and fed the myth of an unshakable system. Those who watched learned not to rebel. Those who suffered became forgotten symbols of law and fate. While physical punishment and execution dominated the justice systems of the Middle Ages, there were also many cases where non-lethal penalties were applied. These alternative forms of punishment, such as imprisonment, exile, fines, and forced labor, were commonly used for those whose offenses were not deemed capital or who were deemed too valuable to be killed outright. Though often less visible than public executions, these punishments still carried significant consequences and shaped medieval society. Imprisonment in the medieval era was not focused on rehabilitation. It was a holding strategy, a place for suspects to await trial or sentencing, or a form of punishment for specific crimes. Prisons varied widely in structure and condition. Some were simple underground dungeons, cold and dark, with damp stone floors and no natural light. Others were rooms in castles, monasteries, or city towers, sometimes shared with rats, insects, and other prisoners. There were no consistent rules governing how prisoners were treated. Food might be provided once or twice a day, usually stale bread, water, and occasionally thin broth. Sanitation was poor, with waste collecting in corners or through holes in the floor. Disease was common. In many cases, prisoners were shackled to walls or the floor to prevent escape. The lack of movement caused sores, muscle loss, and long-term physical damage. Some prisons were maintained by private individuals, such as noble families or ecclesiastical institutions, who had the authority to detain people. These jailers often charged prisoners for their stay, demanding payment for food, bedding, or even access to daylight. If the prisoner had no money, their family was expected to pay, or they remained in chains indefinitely. Long-term imprisonment was rare in early medieval periods due to the expense and inefficiency. However, over time, it became more common, especially for debtors, political dissenters, and those awaiting ransom. Nobles captured in war were sometimes kept for months or years in fortified towers. Their release was negotiated through letters, payments, or political concessions. These prisons were more like enforced house arrest but still represented loss of freedom and prestige. Exile was another non-lethal punishment, used as a way to remove troublesome individuals without resorting to execution. A person declared an exile was forbidden from entering a specific city, region, or kingdom. The banishment could be temporary or permanent, and the punishment carried both practical and symbolic weight. The exile lost land, possessions, and social status. Friends and family might be forbidden from helping them, and crossing the boundaries of exile could lead to further punishment or death. The enforcement of exile varied. In some cases, the individual was escorted to the border and forced to cross. In others, they were left to find their way out under threat of force. Life in exile was difficult. Without a home or community, many exiles became beggars or wanderers. Some found refuge in monasteries or among sympathetic groups, but they remained legally marginalized and socially excluded. Fines were a more flexible form of punishment, often used when the offender was wealthy or the crime was considered economic in nature. Instead of suffering physical harm, the guilty party would pay a designated amount to the Lord, the king, or the church. Fines were applied for offenses such as forest violations, property disputes, or breaches of market laws. The money collected was used to fund local infrastructure, pay court officials, or reward informants. Payment was not always monetary. Fines could take the form of livestock, grain, or tools, especially in rural areas. Some communities kept detailed ledgers recording what each person owed and for what offense. Delays in payment could lead to additional penalties, such as confiscation of property or public humiliation. In some regions, repeat non-payment led to imprisonment or corporal punishment as a final measure. Forced labor was another common sentence, especially for the poor. Convicted individuals were assigned to work on roads, fortresses, ditches, or agricultural lands. These laborers received minimal food, no wages, and few rights. The work was grueling, repetitive, and performed under supervision, sometimes with shackles or whips to enforce discipline. In some cities, forced labor became institutionalized. Prisons were built with attached workyards, where inmates ground grain, tanned leather, or cut wood. The output was used to support the local economy or sold for profit by the authorities. The punishment was framed as corrective, though in practice it often broke the body rather than reforming the spirit. Some forced laborers were conscripted into military or naval service. Instead of being executed or imprisoned, they were placed on ships or in armies, where they faced equally high risks of injury or death. This form of punishment was considered efficient, removing criminals from society while serving the state's needs. Another method was public penance. This involved acts of humiliation that stopped short of physical harm. Offenders were required to walk barefoot through towns, wear specific clothing, or carry signs declaring their misdeeds. These actions were usually accompanied by rituals, such as fasting, kneeling in churches, or repeating prayers aloud. The goal was moral purification and public example, not bodily damage. In religious cases, especially involving minor heresies or immoral behavior, penance was a first step. If accepted and completed, it could absolve the offender of further punishment. If resisted or failed, harsher measures followed. Monasteries often kept detailed records of such acts, measuring obedience through performance. Community service existed in primitive forms. Offenders might be assigned to repair roads, clean latrines, or dig graves. These tasks were assigned by local councils or lords and were usually enforced by public oversight. The visible labor served as a reminder to others and marked the worker as someone undergoing correction. Not all alternative punishments were physical. Some involved restrictions, such as prohibitions on trading, marrying, or owning land. A person might be labeled as dishonorable, losing their legal ability to testify or serve in office. This form of punishment was subtle but long-lasting, reducing a person's social standing and ability to participate in public life. Religious authorities sometimes imposed silence or isolation as punishment. Individuals were forbidden to speak, attend ceremonies, or receive communion. These spiritual exclusions caused fear, as the person was considered cut off not only from society but from salvation itself. In the Middle Ages, punishment was layered. Execution was final. Torture was severe. But exile, labor, and silence carried their own weights. These punishments did not end life but altered it profoundly. They changed how a person lived, how they were seen, and how they were remembered. The goal remained the same: to protect order, reinforce values, and ensure that no one defied the power of the ruling structures. Punishment shaped lives not only through death and pain but through slow erasure. A person fined, exiled, or isolated became less visible, less respected, and eventually forgotten. In the end, every punishment served the same purpose: to make sure others remembered the cost of disobedience. Throughout the Middle Ages, punishment was more than a reaction to crime. It was a deliberate system of regulation, control, and symbolism. Every act of punishment, whether through public executions, imprisonment, exile, or forced labor, served a broader social and political purpose. It was not simply about addressing individual wrongdoing. It was about reinforcing hierarchy, protecting institutions, and preserving a worldview where divine and earthly authority were seen as one. Punishment functioned as ritual. The public nature of executions and humiliations was essential to their meaning. Justice was not served in private. It was performed, repeated, and witnessed. Town squares were stages. Gallows, pillories, and platforms were props. Judges, clerics, and executioners were the actors. The audience, consisting of peasants, merchants, travelers, and children, played their role as observers, reacting with silence, cheers, or jeers. The condemned was the centerpiece of the performance. In many cases, the rituals followed a script. The criminal was paraded through the streets, accompanied by guards. Church bells rang. Priests read prayers. Town criers announced the charges. The criminal might be allowed a final word or gesture of repentance. Then came the punishment. The swing of the blade, the crack of the whip, the lighting of the fire. Afterwards, the remains might be buried in unmarked graves, displayed for days, or scattered as a warning. This repetition of punishment as performance reinforced authority. It reminded people that justice was both near and absolute. The king, the church, and the law were ever-present forces. By watching others suffer, the public learned submission. By participating through approval, prayer, or silence, they were integrated into the system of control. Punishment was also a form of memory. In communities where literacy was rare and written law limited, physical punishment created shared understanding. A branded forehead, a missing hand, or a public scar was a visible record of past behavior. The body became a historical document. It told others what had happened, what had been done, and what could be expected. Children learned punishment early. They watched their elders deal with wrongdoing, learned the meanings of symbols, and understood where the boundaries of behavior lay. Stories about local criminals, executed traitors, or humiliated neighbors circulated from one generation to the next. These stories were cautionary tales, moral instruction, and folklore combined. Control extended across class and gender, though not equally. The poor were punished more often and more severely. The rich, while not immune, had access to alternatives: payment, protection, or exile. Clergy and nobles were sometimes tried in separate courts. Women, especially those accused of moral or sexual offenses, faced unique punishments. Devices like the scold's bridle or ducking stool targeted behavior considered disruptive to the household or community. The punishments were designed not only to hurt but to shame. Punishment also served as economic regulation. Laws concerning weights, measures, markets, and contracts were enforced through fines, beatings, or public exposure. Traders who cheated customers might be placed in stocks. Bakers who sold underweight loaves could be whipped. Craftsmen who broke guild rules were barred from work or forced to display signs of their failure. Justice, in this way, upheld trust in commerce and the flow of goods. Religious influence was constant. Church courts punished sins, heresy, and moral offenses. While some of these punishments were spiritual, such as penance or fasting, others included imprisonment, excommunication, or even execution. Heretics were not just wrong in belief, they were threats to the entire social fabric. To punish them was to defend both earthly and eternal order. Pilgrimage was sometimes assigned as punishment. A person might be required to travel to a distant shrine, barefoot and penniless, as a sign of repentance. This punishment removed the person from their community, placed them in hardship, and forced public exposure in unfamiliar lands. Pilgrimage as punishment was both spiritual and physical, demanding endurance and humility. Seasonal and symbolic timing also mattered. Executions were often held on market days, feast days, or religious festivals. The goal was to ensure maximum attendance and resonance. A hanging just before Easter, a burning during a holy fast, or a whipping on the eve of a saint's day all connected the punishment to broader cosmic themes. The crime, the penalty, and the calendar were linked in a cycle of meaning. Punishment created zones of fear, physical spaces associated with suffering. Gallows hills, execution bridges, whipping posts, and prison towers became landmarks. People avoided them at night or spoke of them in whispers. Yet they remained visible, embedded in the urban or rural landscape. They served as reminders not of crime but of the reach of power. As the Middle Ages progressed, ideas began to shift. With the rise of written law, increasing centralization of power, and growth of legal institutions, punishment began to change. More emphasis was placed on confinement and documentation. Jails were formalized, records were kept, and trials became more structured. Yet the old patterns persisted. Public punishment did not disappear. Rituals remained. Fear endured. Punishment in the Middle Ages was not just about justice. It was about meaning. Pain was not only physical, it was symbolic. Every scar, every missing limb, every public humiliation was part of a larger narrative. That narrative said, authority is sacred, order is eternal, and disobedience will be crushed. In this system, mercy was rare. When it came, it was seen as a gift, not a right. A shortened sentence, a lighter flogging, or a spared life was interpreted as divine favor or noble generosity. The rule was severity. Exceptions confirmed the rule. Even in sleep, the structures of punishment remained. Dreaming peasants remembered the sound of gallows ropes creaking. Aging exiles recalled the road they had walked. Scarred hands reminded their owners of crimes paid for and debts never forgiven. The memory of punishment lingered, silent, slow, and constant. And so, through darkness and silence, cold cells and burning pyres, through lashes, chains, and exile, punishment maintained the shape of the medieval world. It stitched together belief and fear, obedience and power. It reminded everyone, high and low, of what would happen if the line was crossed. Thus ended each day in the shadow of the whip, the rope, the sword, and the flame. And thus continued the night, quiet, ordered, and under watchful eyes.